Bad onboarding is like serving frozen pizza for the first course of a gourmet meal. It does not get you excited about the next course. Sloppy offboarding, especially after layoffs, destroys your recruiting efforts and drops morale of employees who stayed. Do not mess up these moments. Instead, listen to what Amy Davies, founder of First 30, has to tell us.
Hey there, I'm Krista Vance, entrepreneur and operations leader.
And I'm Matt Vance, award-winning author and social innovation researcher. We're your hosts of the Culture Profit Podcast.
Your place for purposeful company culture strategy.
Learn from HR pros, executives, and thought leaders how to prioritize profits by prioritizing people.
This episode is sponsored by Mobrium, the best friend of forward-thinking HR leaders, helping you strengthen your employer reputation as a reflection of your real culture.
Learn more at mobrium.com.
All right, welcome everyone. Just like onboarding sets the tone for the employee-employer relationship, offboarding can be equally important for protecting goodwill after a separation. And this applies to voluntary and involuntary departures. Today, we have an impressive author and founder from Canada with tips to help you make the most of these moments in the employment life cycle. We'd love to welcome Amy Davies. Thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you very much for having me. Have you had any other Canadian guests on your show before?
I don't think we've had, remember Russell?
Yeah,
yeah.
You're right.
He's the host
Russell
of the
Lowlatcher.
Relationships at Work podcast. So yeah, we'll see you
Okay.
later. He's pretty cool too. So
Oh, wow.
all the
Okay.
Canadians are way up there on our list.
Well, you know that all Canadians get along with each other, right? So we'll absolutely have to check them out.
We were
Definitely.
talking earlier. Matt's dad is from Canada, so there's a little bit of connection there.
Yep,
That's
I'm half
right,
Canadian, so it's a good thing for sure.
Yes. Well, we want to hear a little bit more about you. Before founding First 30, Amy worked in leadership roles for top-tier companies in North America and the UK, including Unilever. Is it Unilever or Unilever?
Unilever. That's right, Unilever.
Okay. Mars, Wrigley, Grainger and Rogers. She currently lives in the GTA, is a voracious podcast listener, and the proud pet parent of a Doberman named Riker. Okay, tell me what a Doberman is. Is that
Well,
a
they're big dogs. They
Okay.
are, ours is like a black and tan color. He's about 75 pounds. They have short hair. They're very sleek looking.
Wow.
I know
Some owners crop their ears. We kept his uncropped. He looks scary enough as it is. But they're very intelligent and
Wow.
extremely annoying. They're called Velcro dogs, as a matter of fact, and
Because they like
I-
to be close to you?
all the time. So
Really?
right now
Oh
he's
my
out on a
gosh.
walk with his dad. But
Nice.
I do not recommend them as a breed unless you are really, really into dogs. We are, so we're good,
Yeah.
but they require a lot of attention and exercise. Yes.
Not one of those dogs you can just stick in the yard, right?
Not at all. Quite the opposite. Yes.
Well, that is very cool. Oh man. Well, we want to hear more about your career experience. How did you get started with First 30?
Yeah, so I always wanted to run a business, really strange, like almost right from the get-go, the beginning of my career. I think maybe it's because I don't like being told what to do. I don't know, to be my own boss. But I started thinking about writing a career book, and I didn't want to write a book that, there's a lot of career books out there. I wanted mine to be a little bit different. So I started writing every organization that I was at. So Unilever in the UK, I worked at the head office there, and they went through one of their first big reorgs, like their restructuring, when I was working there. And I was just shocked at the reaction of the employees. I was new to the corporate world, so it was everything was new to me, but to them, this was a real shock to the system. So over time, every organization, I worked in telco, right? There's always restructuring going on in telco. So I really learned what changes and what happens in organizations when they do go through restructuring, what happens to the employees and what happens to productivity. So I started working on a book all about living and having a successful career in what I refer to as a reorg world, where we're constantly losing and changing our jobs. And then from that, I was laid off twice over the course of my career, and I had the benefit of outplacement services, which are, if anyone of your listeners doesn't know what they are, it's when companies will hire another company to help their exiting employees recover from the job loss and get back to work. And I thought the services were good, but I felt like I could do this even better if I did something. And so after I wrote the book, I thought, oh my gosh, I have an amazing program here. So I turned it into this, what I think of is a pretty engaging program that's very relevant for today's business world and career professional, to help them recover from the job loss, get back to work. And I was able to make it really cost effective, which excited me, because I really feel like every single person who's laid off in an organization deserves that support and help to get back to work quickly, especially in the US, where a lot of employees, their benefits are tied to their employer. In Canada, we have the benefit and the privilege of having universal health care, but not everyone has that. So I know with our American participants, they move really quickly. In Canada, people get laid off in June. They're like, I'm not even looking until September. But in the US, it's a very different situation. So it's really nice to be able to help people through this very difficult time of their life. So that's First 30 started as an outplacement company. We evolved to become an onboarding company and a training company. We were tech-based. So we've just used our technology to build new programs, and onboarding and training are some of the things that we've explored and started doing really well with.
That's incredible. I think just in the last year and a half, I can't tell you how many people I've seen being laid off, and how hard it is emotionally and even physically for their family if they're not able to provide, some of the lifestyle or needs that they previously were able to provide for.
Yeah, that's a big goal for sure. I'm curious. Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, all I was gonna say is, if you put them in a really good program, like I know for our participants, most of them are back to work within 3 months, and that is like a meaningful work. So we focus mainly on entry level, mid. We have an executive program. Executives, it can be more difficult to get back to work when people are later in their career. Unfortunately, their age doesn't exist. It can be really difficult, but we have a very high success rate getting employees focused forward and back to work.
Now that is so impactful for people, for individuals, for families, for communities, for companies, the impact of having a more successful and as positive as possible work transition when it's involuntary is huge. So I'm so excited to dive a little bit deeper into this conversation. Before we kind of jump into some of our questions, I was just curious, the name of your first book, published in 2019, is A Spark in the Dark. So I'm just curious about the name there and how that came to be.
Well, there's another, I didn't want to make you have to say all of it, but the next part of that title is Illuminating Your Path to a Successful Career in a Reorg World. So that's the full title of the book. And it was a little trial and error with that title. I just felt like it can be a very dark time, right? Especially when there's recessions, a lot of restructuring going on. And I thought, we're not getting a lot of guidance. So here's my little spark for you, but you have to do a lot of the work yourself. You can't rely on other people. So it's a spark. I'm not carrying a propane tank behind you, but hopefully it's hopeful, but also it's a call to action for the people who read it.
I love that. Cool. And very memorable. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Let's dive into, so we want to cover two main topics today in our conversation. We want to talk about onboarding and about offboarding. So which I'm so excited to talk more about this, because
I think this is an overlooked part of employee experience. And, one of the main principles in memory is primacy and recency. And so we oftentimes remember our first experience somewhere or something and our last experience. And that is literally onboarding and offboarding with employment.
Yes, exactly.
So we cannot overlook that part, because if you have a really poor onboarding, you will remember that. And if you are offboarded poorly, you will remember that. And that will be what you share with other people when you leave that employment opportunity. So yes. So
these are moments of real vulnerability as well. You're feeling
Yes.
vulnerable both when you start in an organization and when you leave.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
So in your opinion, why is onboarding so important?
Well, go ahead, Matt.
And where do you see the most companies fail? Just like,
sure.
Where are they stumbling?
Well, it's important for exactly what you were discussing, that it is, there's that impact when we start an organization, when we're engaging with any new stimulus, whether that is a new restaurant, a new person, or a new employer, we are imprinting. And we're cognitively highly receptive. And that's a rapid learning process that we're going through, that we've depended on this as a species for our survival since humans existed, pretty much. So it's not something we can just turn on and turn off, nor can an employer turn it on or turn it off. So it kind of ties to what I think the biggest mistake is that employers are making. And that is, we know, and we even say it, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. And it is so true. But employers, it's mindset. They seem to have this idea that they're always going to get a second chance to make a first impression. When I started my career, that maybe have been the case in some respects, because I grew up in a time in the corporate world where you did what you were told. Your employer had the power, and you were subordinate to them. We live in a very different world now. Employees are extremely expensive to companies, and they can be very hard to find. And there's a huge competition for top talent. And I know we say it, and there's buzzwords and these, click-worthy headlines. It is very true, though, that it is really hard to keep your best people in your organization. And you should care about the productivity of everyone in your organization. So there's many, many mistakes that companies make, but the first one is not really realizing the importance of investing in these types of programs for their new hires.
That makes sense. Yeah, it starts with the mindset of recognizing the importance of what we're talking about. I mean, I've spoken to so many different employers, so many different HR leaders and executives, and I find it very fascinating that costs are looked at differently when we're talking about, someone inside the company can do this thing versus we're going to pay an outside company to do this. It's like this weird separation of expenses to the business, that payroll is not an expense somehow. Yes. but it is. Every single person's time is, whether they're paid more or less, or in a different position or less, if they're spending time on something, that is money to the company. They could be doing something else. They could be contributing in another way. And yeah, it's key to recognize the importance that setting the tone here has on that employment relationship, and having a mindset that this is serious. It's important.
And it's not just about, to your point here, it's not just about this feel-good situation. It's not even only about productivity. It is about cost of the business. So we know from research that 33% of new hires will leave within their first 6 months. I would also argue that there's many that are leaving. If you're in manufacturing, they're leaving even before they start. There's a lot of ghosting that happens, and we can talk in a few minutes about one of the strategies for avoiding having a new hire ghost you as an employer, because it is happening.
Yeah.
But it costs at a minimum 30 to 50% of an employee's salary to replace them. That's at a minimum. That doesn't even account for all the soft costs, the time lost, the morale damage that it will do to your organization when new hires leave. So we need to really be thinking and investing in these things. And I would say the other huge mistake that companies make, they do, and I can say this because I'm on the front lines of this, they do not invest in onboarding. And they have these HRIS that are amazing. Listen, there's some incredible HRIS. So I hate to say HRIS systems because it's like HRI, the system is the last word, but it feels weird not to say it. And they want everything to work together. That's fine. Those onboarding widgets in most HRIS, they are not they're not changing the game for your organization. The way that ours, and this by no means is a sales pitch, but I want your listeners to look at any technology they're bringing in. It may not marry the system perfectly that you have in place already, but will it work and do a really good job at what you need it to do best? Like some technologies are wide reaching and they're meant to do many things. And some technologies do one thing and they do that one thing very, very well. And I would love to be at a stage where that's all integrated, but the reality is there is very few, if there are any, and if there are, they're very expensive. But I'm happy to be told I'm wrong, that will seamlessly integrate with the technology that you have in your company today.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. You gotta have things connected, but it comes at a cost. You've got to balance getting the outcomes that you want with your technology.
That's right.
Yeah, and it makes sense that, just having a technology isn't the Band-Aid that's gonna heal that first experience that employees have when they come to your organization. And so I'd love for us to dive into, what does a successful onboarding plan look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing is pre-boarding. Once someone joins your organization, oftentimes we're sending them a criminal background check, benefits documents to sign. Like, this is not inspiring. This is necessary. It's not inspiring. So we cannot call that pre-boarding. Pre-boarding is, I just signed my offer with your organization. My manager, who may not be the person who's communicating with me about the offer because I'm communicating with HR, my manager, as soon as possible, sends me an email and says, Amy, I'm thrilled to hear that you've signed the offer back. Thank you so much. We're so excited to have you on board. And then that manager reaches out to me maybe a couple times, or you set me up with a buddy who's my peer in the organization. They don't even have to be a member of my own team. Just someone I can ask those stupid questions to, like, what do people really wear to the office? You can feel a little silly showing up in your Sunday best in an office that's really casual. So I think it's a really good idea to let someone know, really give them the real deal on what people wear to the office, what time they come in, what time they leave. So that's pre-boarding. Send them some fun things about your company. If you've got great engagement scores, I know that's the area that you work in, send them that information about how well you're doing as an employer. So send them things that you're excited about working on. There's a lot of things from a technology standpoint you could do to make this process easier. Setting up an email campaign like marketers do for customers, you can actually do that for your new hires before they even start, and have like 5 fun messages go out to them automatically once their email is in your system, even their personal email. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, whether someone's starting remotely or whether they're coming into the office, give them a little time on that first day. So I don't like when companies expect someone to have everything set up at 8 or 8:30 a.m. on their very first day. If they are working remotely, give them the first few hours of that day to get their technology set up. That's not their responsibility to do on the weekend. I, at one point in my life, was a single mom of 2 young kids. And I can tell you right now, I would have not had time to set up my whole tech setup on the weekend with 2 little
Yeah.
kids running around. So
Yeah.
we really have to be mindful of that. So I absolutely love when companies allow new hires to come in late or start late on their first day and leave early, because managers aren't even set up for them, right? So that means they might be sitting in your waiting lounge, the lounge of your office for an extended period of time. That's a horrible way to start a new job. Yeah. And then when it comes to learning the business, we really have to remember that memories are fragile. They're fragile at the best of times, as a matter of fact. But when we're starting a new job, we're nervous, we're trying to make a good impression, we're meeting a lot of new people, and then we sit through like a half day or a day of orientation, right? Or we're learning all kinds of new systems and everyone wants to cram everything in. And then our minds are like a sieve. We can't remember anything, or we remember very little.
Yeah.
And then once we try to apply that knowledge, we're embarrassed because then we have to go back and ask people, how do you do this again? And how do you do that? I love task-based training for that. So task-based videos that you have housed somewhere that employees can actually find that say, okay, you need to fill out your first benefits. Your company that you're using for benefits probably has videos that you could put on a platform or on a shared SharePoint where your employees can access them, and send them that information. If you're going to send it out by email, clearly label that email. And again, I think that automation can be so helpful here, but very few companies are actually utilizing it. Larger companies, yes, to some extent. Smaller and mid-sized companies, not very much at all.
Okay. Yeah, those are some incredible tips. And I think, yeah, you only remember so much. I mean, I think back to my own onboarding experiences, and if you have some type of a library that's very easy to navigate, where you can go search for different topics of where is this or how does that work, that relieves some of that pressure of, oh man, I've got to remember everything. And
yes,
and it can be so boring to sit and it's like the first week of school is all disclosures. It's the same kind of thing. You kind of turn the volume down and you're just like, hey, when can I do some of the work that I was hired for? And so I think if you can, like you're saying, that task-based idea, if you can kind of combine the work that they need to do with training as they kind of get into it, it can help them feel purpose and feel more excited about what they've been hired for. I was going to ask, what do you think about interviewing? Does that fit within the pre-boarding as well, like the interview process, and then, I don't know, submitting an application or resume?
Yeah, well, I think it is really, really important. I don't see it as part of the onboarding. I see it as part of how you're putting your best foot forward as an employer.
Yes.
And the reason I don't think so is that's a whole other world onto itself. And often that is a talent acquisition area. And I do think it has to be treated very specifically. But I also think that I don't think any one department should own onboarding. I think, yes, you have your orientation, but then you have your on-the-job training. So you have your managers. But I do think that needs to be treated as a separate entity, but it needs to be cohesive with every other communication that you have. It's like, when I see onboarding materials, because I see a lot of this too, is you see like this hodgepodge of resources that have different branding on them or different fonts. Like, consistency actually breeds trust. So the more consistent we can be in all of our touch points with our employees in general, but our new hires specifically, knowing how vulnerable they are, the better. I wanted to make one more point, if you don't mind, about a big mistake. And just reminding me, because we're talking about having technology as support. Make sure that your new hires have the tools they need to do their job. If they don't, the worst thing you can do is look at them and say, oh, this sort of thing happens all the time around here. Because what happens to that employee? And this happens a lot. And this employee doesn't want to be like, oh my gosh, if this is how it's going for me, how is it going for our customers? Right now, they're suddenly worried about the business. They don't feel that they can trust you. And we were talking about imprinting And what happens once people have imprinted, they build what's called a belief system. And once that belief system is established, it can be very difficult, if not impossible, to change. And I always try to make the case by saying, like, have you ever tried to change anyone's mind about pretty much anything, right?
Yeah. And one thing that you said really stood out to me: consistency breeds trust. And so that can be from the very first time you apply, all the way through onboarding, all the way through employment, and having consistency of recognizing the brand is organized and they are supportive.
They're communicating between departments too.
Yes,
That's
right.
a tough one. So.
And no company's perfect. I recognize that. There's a whole additional worlds that we could talk about with internal communication and collaboration and surveys and all of that. But the point I wanted to make that you brought up is that is the case on the talent acquisition piece. When an employee or a job seeker is searching for a company, if they see consistency in how the brand is showing up, even down to are all of their logos the same on all of the different social media platforms. Because if there are duplicate profiles, unclaimed profiles, a really great rating on Glassdoor and a really horrible rating on In-Her site, that creates reputation disparity, and it completely damages trust. It makes the job seeker feel like, holy cow, does this company even know what they're doing? Does the right hand know what the left hand is doing? And that feeling completely ostracizes the job seekers to where they're not applying. But I think, to your point, in the onboarding process, that same experience can happen if we're not organized, if we're not purposeful, if we're not consistent with our branding, our materials, our communications. Then it can be worse, though, because the person's in the door now. And now they're having those feelings that a job seeker, a job seeker could have that experience if you're not cohesive online, you're not represented consistently. But it could be even worse, because now they're in the door and they're going, oh man, what did I sign up for? So yeah, that consistency is critically important, and employer branding is a function that should be a part of this whole conversation as well. Is our talent acquisition presence, like how we're showing up online, consistent? Is our onboarding presence and process and consistent? Are we showcasing a strong employer brand through this? So there's my thought.
Anything else you wanted to add to onboarding?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's so much to add. We could talk about this all day, but I don't I don't think that's a good idea for your listeners. I don't think they'll have all day to listen. But I do love what you were saying about, and I know that some of what Mobrium does is you do that social listening for companies. So you help them understand, and then, as I understand it, you also help them drive up their scores on all of these sites, which I think is critical. Because what would you feel like if you do a reference check on an employee and you get 3 vastly different perspectives from the 3 people you've spoken to? They're all talking about different skills that this person has, or different qualities, different areas where they need maybe some support. It's going to make you lose trust in that candidate. So turn that around on your organization, because guess what your new hire has been doing for the last 3 to 6 months until they've joined your company? They've been interviewing with other employers. You might have been the first one that made them the offer. They get inside your organization, and I'm convinced this is what drives the third that leave within the first 6 months. Oh my gosh, I have made a huge mistake. And boom.
I should have gone with this other company, right?
And guess what? That company makes them a job offer. Or the offer still stands and they leave. This is why I know this isn't for employees, but this is why I always tell the participants in our program, once you get a new job, that's amazing. I'm sure you're going to be super excited to tell everyone, wait 3 months, put it up on LinkedIn, because you don't know what you're going to do now. You don't know what could happen.
That's a good point.
Very smart.
So let's talk about offboarding. So why is it important? I mean, we've talked about why it's important, but where do you see most companies fail, especially during layoffs?
Well, there is a number of things like onboarding, right? For one thing, it's like in my day when I started, I mean, I'm not that old, but I'm old enough for that. It was long enough ago. The world looked a little bit different. Someone might ride off into the sunset and you never see or hear from them again. We live in a very different social media world now. We're all connected. A person leaves your organization, whether by choice or because of restructuring, they're around. They're still communicating. They're going on Indeed and Glassdoor and filling out reviews, right? And that's definitely something where we are very in sync. So we want to make sure, and you were talking about recency effect, right? So we want to make sure that the last experiences they have with our company are also positive. If we're having a wide-scale layoff, number one, I don't think that companies should take the amputation approach to layoffs. And by amputation approach, I'm sure you have a picture of what that can look like. You are immediately cut off from the organization. Your laptop is taken, your phone might be taken, your ID card is taken, and you are walked by security to the door. Having worked in telecommunications, I did see that quite a lot. So what does that do? First of all, it's shocking for everyone, right? It's particularly shocking for the individual who's now just thrust out in the middle of the day from their, home. In a sense,
like a criminal, right?
Yeah, that's kind of how you feel. So I really strongly would urge any employer, if they can, I know it's not always possible, take the working notice approach. I call it the white gloves approach or the soft gloves approach, to layoffs, and give people a little bit of notice and time. You'd be surprised how they rise to the challenge. Let them use your printer to print off a few copies of their resume. Get them started, and we'll talk in a minute about outplacement, but get them started with that career transition support and moving towards a new role. So they're not going to be emailing HR. They're not going to be threatening legal action. Like, it's so much more civilized. And the thing that a lot of companies forget is the productivity and the engagement of their employees who are left behind. So if you take a softer approach to layoffs, you will get more commitment to your employees who are already in the organization. It just all feels so much more civilized and compassionate. Like, take the compassionate approach. We could go in, and I don't know how far down you want to go, but there is the whole issue of communication. That's very difficult. But this is what I will say about communication and planning. Senior leaders, this layoffs are going to happen. You've known about this for like 6 months to 8 months, maybe even a year, right? Then you need to bring your management team along, right? Your director level, etc. You tell them, and now you just want it done. But there's this sort of change curve that people go through and all these emotions they go through. You've gone through all the emotions. You're at the other end and you're like, let's get her done, people. Your people you've just told are like, wait a second. They're going through all that emotional turmoil that you've already gone through, and you're expecting them to be where you are. You need to bring them along as much as you can. So there's so many different aspects of that. I won't get into all of them, but realize as leadership, you've had a lot of time to digest this. You need to really help and give space and time to people. I know you want to move things along, but you really need to help them come through the other end with you. And then of course, I can't be objective about outplacement and career transition support. It comes at such a small cost to you as a business. Like, some of our programs anyway are $500 per participant. And, wow. Most outplacement companies will offer like a volume discount. If you have a lot of employees going through, they'll offer you discounts based on the size of the layoff, if they can, right? But these are very small numbers for a huge return. You're not going to have someone emailing HR and legal, and maybe they're going to have a few, but they're going to be a lot less than you would otherwise. And these people are going to move on. If you have a clawback, do you know what a clawback is? When you lay someone off, often what companies will do is if they've given them a severance, the severance is meant to cover them for the time they're out of work. But if you get back to work quickly, and say your severance is 6 months and you get back in 3 months to work, your company is entitled to not have to pay you for that other 3 months. So the amount of money it could save, the heartache it could save your organization, the morale boost to employees who are still working with you now, seeing that they're the exiting employees are taken care of. Think about like an Indeed or Glassdoor review when the company has supported someone rather, I mean, listen, people are going to say bad things, but there might not be the same sting in what they're saying.
Yeah.
If you've given them really good, highly professional career transition support that helps them get back to work, they're going to be focused on the rest of their life. They're not looking back at you.
To me, that seems like a handoff where it's like, I'm sorry that we're letting you go, but here you go.
Yes.
I can hand you off to these guys and they're going to take care of you. And that shows so much care from the organization.
Absolutely.
With very little input, like you said, both on cost and on their actual like time. To just be like, we care that, I know it didn't work out here for you, but we care that you're taken care of and that you head somewhere and head in a good place with your next employment.
Like individual personalized care as well that the company can offer at scale in that, you know, mass restructuring moment. I do have a question for you. So I've been a part of layoffs as well. I've seen it. I've been the one to break the news to people. It is difficult. There's no getting around that. It's a challenging event that happens. I've seen from the employer side concern about security. And if we were to give that white glove approach and give people notice that someone's going to do something that they shouldn't with access to company systems. So I'm curious, what do you think?
What's the risk?
Yeah, like how do you
opinion?
balance that individual care and giving that white glove treatment to give people notice while minimizing security risk to the business?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you have to hire people that you think are worthy of your organization. And before we were talking, I was interviewed for a podcast all about psychopaths and the prevalence. And I know, and people always laugh when I talk about it, but we would be surprised if we all knew as much as I do about psychopathy. It's really quite scary. And there are ways to mitigate risk to your business and not end up hiring the types of people who would do those things in the first place and weeding them out. So that is one way, but obviously we're not in that position when we're running layoffs. So if we haven't taken that, we're too late if we haven't taken that action already. So yeah, there may be risk. I'm not sure how huge it would be. How big of secrets and access does someone have? Like, I know companies used to be very concerned about their customer lists. Now that LinkedIn exists, I mean, what are you protecting at that point, right? Mm-hmm. People have this information. Someone who is of that type, they're that type of person, they might have already downloaded that to their own, like people's home and work life are so in sync now. They probably have all the files you don't want them to have on a cloud somewhere. You don't even know that they're there, right? So I know that's probably not filling employers with a sense of ease or anything, but treat them well. Just treat them well when they're leaving, and you're going to mitigate that risk. Because I don't know that you're making that risk greater by walking them right out the door. And the big thing when you're walking, and I actually was going to say, I have, First 30 has a free download of how to run compassionate layoffs. If you have a notes page where you leave show notes, I'm happy to share the link to access that as well. We also have a guide to employee onboarding, and I'm happy to share that with your listeners. Like I said, it's all free to download. There's some really great content in there. We don't have time in the podcast, like 30 minutes or so, to talk about all of these things, because it's like, how do you run the discussions? That's a whole nother conversation. But the big thing is, if you are forced to exit someone and take the amputation approach, the one thing that I so highly recommend, do not take their phone away. Like, you don't know where they are emotionally. Phones are, you know what a phone is like. That is an extension of your arm.
That's a literal amputee, right? If you take that.
Exactly. So please keep in mind what the consequences could be of taking someone's their phone away emotionally to them, and the backlash that it could have on the business if you do something like that. It's not worth it. It's not worth it to do that. Right? Yeah. You can get them in as part of their contract and leaving your organization. There's things you can work in. I'm not a lawyer or an employment lawyer, and I'm not an expert, but I'm sure that you can speak to your lawyers, and there's ways to work things into contracts. So, and I mean, that's not just the severance agreement. It's also their agreement when they start working for your business. It can all be built in there, so you can protect yourself in other ways. But my goodness, if the worst happens with an employee and you've taken their phone away, that you might carry that with you.
Yeah.
So quick question before we end here. What would you say is the optimal amount of time to give notice for terminating someone?
I like 4 to 6 weeks myself. I know that seems long. It really does give someone a chance to wrap up the work. I have seen cases, and I'm involved in an organization where I had a case of this. Someone just was not, I mean, we laid off a lot of people, and this one person was just causing a lot of problems, but everyone else was fine. This was just one individual, and they were told they were going to be paid, but they were asked to not come back in to the office anymore. So I'd say 4 to 6 weeks is a good amount of time, but you can give less if you want. I think 2 weeks seems a little short to me, but that's just me, because you do benefit as an organization from the knowledge transfer as well that you're going to get from that person. Yeah. And even if you don't want them to come in the office the whole time, hey, would you be okay if we continue to pay you? Would you take calls on the projects that you're running? Most reasonable people are going to understand, especially if there's a really clear reason for the layoff as well. And I was going to say that when it comes to communicating these things, and when it comes to giving working notice, the thing that makes people feel the least well, I mean, wellness is a variable. It can change throughout the course of the day. But what we know really affects well-being, I used to study it when I worked at Unilever, is the control taken away from you about your own outcome. Mm-hmm. That has the highest impact on your well-being of almost anything else, right? So once someone has the news, they have that finality, whether it's knowing they haven't got a job, even if it's bad news, or knowing if they're going to lose the job they have, there's a certain calm that enters the picture, because, hey, now I have control over what is going to happen to me next. So that's a huge positive for people to know, to have the knowledge about what is going to happen.
Very well said.
Yeah. Well, Amy, oh my goodness, you are a wealth of information, and it sounds like there's even more we can dive into. We will definitely post those links for our listeners, and just go ahead and grab them and head there if this is something that you're over. But thank you so much. Like, this is some of the most actionable information that we've received on this topic, and I think it's going to be super useful for our listeners. So thank you for your time today.
Yep. Everybody go check out Amy's profile on LinkedIn. We'll link to that as well, so you can follow her and check out First 30. And thank you for being here with us. Remember to leave a review of the Culture Profit and follow along as we seek to prove that putting people first is best for business. So thank you again, Amy, for being with us.
Thanks, Amy.
Thank you so much. Take care.
Cool.
Thanks for tuning in to the Culture Profit podcast, and for being a part of our journey to prove that putting people first is best for business.
Today's episode was sponsored by Mobrium.
Want to get more employee reviews and streamline your employer reputation? Visit mobrium.com.
Now go find one way to prioritize your people and watch your profits grow.